The autumn air was crisp and vibrant in Briarwood Heights, Massachusetts. The small, picturesque town was alive with the annual Harvest Arts Festival, a beloved tradition that brought together artists, craftsmen, and townsfolk in a celebration of creativity and community. Among the rows of booths displaying pottery, woodwork, and paintings, one stall stood out, an enchanting collection of botanical illustrations, each piece so delicate and intricate it seemed to breathe life. Elara Sinclair sat quietly behind the booth, her hazel eyes scanning the crowd. Her work reflected her soul, a symphony of nature's beauty captured with ink and color. Elara wasn't just an artist, she was a storyteller, weaving emotions into the veins of every leaf and petal she drew. Yet, beneath her calm exterior, a lingering sense of inadequacy flickered. Would anyone here truly see her worth? As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting a warm golden glow, a man approached her booth. His tailored coat and confident stride made him impossible to ignore. Marcus Greystone exuded charisma, the kind that made people stop and listen. His presence commanded attention, and the way he carried himself hinted at both power and control. He paused in front of Elara's display, his steel-gray eyes narrowing as he studied her work. "These are extraordinary," he said, his voice smooth and rich, like the first sip of a fine wine. "You've captured something most people miss, the soul of these plants." Elara looked up, startled by the sincerity in his tone. She wasn't used to such direct praise, especially from someone who seemed so commanding. "Thank you," she replied softly, her cheeks flushing. "It's a passion of mine." "A passion well worth pursuing," Marcus replied. He lingered, asking her about her techniques, her inspirations. As the conversation flowed, Elara felt herself drawn to him, not just by his words but by the way he seemed entirely focused on her. It was as if, in that moment, she was the only person in the world. Hours passed like minutes. Marcus's knowledge of art surprised her. He spoke with the precision of someone who truly understood her craft. "I sponsor several local artists," he said, casually slipping his hands into his pockets. "If you're interested, I could connect you with some influential people. Your work deserves a bigger audience." The offer was tempting, almost too tempting. Elara hesitated, wary of how easily she felt swayed by this stranger. "That's very kind of you," she said. "But I'm just starting out. I'm not sure if I'm ready for all of that." Marcus smiled, a gesture that felt like both reassurance and challenge. "The best opportunities come when we least expect them," he said. "Let's start with dinner. I'd love to hear more about your vision." Against her better judgment, Elara found herself saying yes. It wasn't just his offer, it was the way he looked at her, as though he saw potential in her that she hadn't yet discovered herself. That evening, they dined at a charming restaurant on the outskirts of town, a place Marcus seemed to know well. The candlelit atmosphere and intimate setting made the night feel magical. Marcus was attentive, asking questions that made Elara feel seen and valued. For the first time in years, she let her guard down, charmed by his unwavering confidence and apparent admiration for her. Over the next few weeks, Marcus became a constant presence in Elara's life. He sent her bouquets of wildflowers with handwritten notes, appeared at her studio with coffee just the way she liked it, and introduced her to people who could elevate her career. Every gesture felt carefully curated, designed to make her feel special. Yet, even in these early, blissful days, there were subtle undercurrents. Marcus's compliments sometimes carried a hint of critique. "Your use of color is beautiful," he would say, "but have you considered something bolder? It might make your work more marketable." Elara took his feedback as encouragement, not realizing that these were the first threads of a web being spun around her. By December, Marcus had become the center of her world. When he suggested she move into his sprawling home in the quiet outskirts of Briarwood Heights, it seemed like a natural next step. "You'll have so much more space to create," he said, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "And we'll be together. Isn't that what we both want?" The house was everything Elara could have dreamed of, spacious, elegant, and filled with light. But as she crossed the threshold with her belongings, a shiver ran down her spine. She dismissed it as nerves, telling herself that Marcus had only ever been kind and supportive. Yet deep down, something whispered, this is the beginning of a new chapter. What Elara didn't realize was that the story Marcus had planned for her was far darker than she could have ever imagined. The stark contrast between Marcus Greystone and Elara Sinclair's childhoods was not immediately obvious to the casual observer. On the surface, they were two individuals connected by their shared admiration for art. Yet, their upbringings could not have been more different, one shaped by strict control, the other by unbounded freedom. Marcus's early life unfolded within the walls of a grand home on the outskirts of Boston, a mansion that reflected the success of the Greystone family. His parents, Frederick and Margaret, were pillars of the community, business moguls with a reputation for perfection. The Greystones ran a vast network of commercial properties, and their wealth was rivaled only by their expectation for flawless success. Frederick, his father, was a man driven by cold ambition. His stern, calculating demeanor left little room for anything but achievement. The only thing that matters, he would often say, is success. The rest is noise. Marcus, an only child, was expected to follow in his father's footsteps, bearing the heavy burden of family pride. His mother, Margaret, was equally imposing, though in a more subtle way. A former socialite turned philanthropist, she demanded perfection in all things. From the way Marcus dressed to the manner in which he spoke, there was an unspoken rule that nothing should ever be less than immaculate. As a child, Marcus excelled in his studies, his mind a sharp tool that quickly absorbed the world's expectations. But it wasn't just his academics that impressed, he was a perfectionist in every facet of life. His schoolwork was redone multiple times until it met the exacting standards he set for himself. His teachers praised his dedication, unaware that behind his success was an obsessive compulsion to control every detail of his environment. On the playground, Marcus wasn't interested in games or sports. Instead, he orchestrated elaborate rules and systems, forcing his peers to follow them precisely. He would assign roles, dictate the flow of activities, and if anyone deviated, they were swiftly punished with exclusion. It was a microcosm of the world his parents had constructed for him, an environment where rules were unyielding and conformity was paramount. At home, Marcus's life was defined by structure. Every aspect of the household was meticulously planned. Dinner was served at precisely 6 p.m., and there was no room for deviation. The furniture was arranged according to a specific pattern, and even the family dog had a regimented routine. His parents' love was not shown through affection or warmth, but through control. They believed that by imposing their rigid standards, they were preparing Marcus for greatness. But in reality, it was a suffocating existence, one that would later shape his adult relationships. In stark contrast, Elara's childhood was filled with the kind of freedom and creativity that Marcus could never have imagined. Born to Arthur and Evelyn Sinclair, Elara was raised in a modest yet vibrant home in Briarwood Heights. Arthur, a nature photographer, and Evelyn, a pottery artist, encouraged their children to explore the world around them, finding beauty in the everyday. The Sinclair household was a haven of color and warmth, its walls adorned with pictures of the world's natural wonders and handcrafted ceramics. From a young age, Elara displayed a deep connection to the natural world. Her sketchbooks, filled with detailed drawings of wildflowers, leaves, and animals, became her most cherished possessions. She spent hours in the woods surrounding their home, sketching the flora and fauna that flourished there, and her parents nurtured this passion, offering endless support for her artistic pursuits. Unlike Marcus, who was conditioned to be perfect in every way, Elara was encouraged to embrace her imperfections. Evelyn often said, "Perfection is a myth, my dear. It's the flaws that make the world beautiful." It was a philosophy that resonated deeply with Elara. She was taught to value creativity over conformity, and her childhood was filled with the sounds of laughter, the smell of clay in the kiln, and the freedom to explore her artistic talents without restraint. Though Ilara excelled academically, her true passion lay in her art. She would often lose herself in her drawings, capturing the essence of life around her with raw emotion. There was no formula for her creations, no prescribed rules to follow. Instead, her work was an expression of the world as she saw it, imperfect, fleeting, and beautiful. Her parents never pushed her to be the best, they simply wanted her to be true to herself. Ilara's brother, Caleb, played a significant role in her life. 2 years older, Caleb was her protector and confidant. They spent countless hours together, exploring the woods, talking about their dreams, and laughing at the absurdities of life. Caleb was the one who first recognized Ilara's potential as an artist, encouraging her to pursue it seriously. He often showcased her work to their friends, proud of her talent and the joy her art brought to others. But despite the warmth and support of her family, Ilara's life was forever changed when tragedy struck. Caleb was killed in a car accident during her sophomore year of high school, and the grief that followed was overwhelming. The loss left a permanent mark on Ilara, and though she tried to move on, she could never fully escape the fear of losing those she loved. In the wake of Caleb's death, Ilara struggled with feelings of abandonment, even as her parents tried to help her through the grief. It was then that her desire for stability, something to hold on to, grew stronger. She began to long for a partner who could offer her the security and sense of safety she had lost. Little did she know, this need for stability would eventually make her vulnerable to Marcus's manipulative charm. When Ilara and Marcus met, it was as though two completely different worlds collided. Marcus, with his obsessive need for control and perfection, saw in Ilara the perfect blank canvas, someone who could be molded into the image he desired. And Ilara, scarred by her past and seeking the stability she lacked, was drawn to Marcus's confidence and promise of security. But the cracks in their relationship would begin to show soon enough. Marcus's need for control, something that had been ingrained in him since childhood, would ultimately push Ilara into a place where her free-spirited nature could no longer flourish. And as their worlds collided, the illusion of perfection Marcus had built around himself would slowly begin to unravel. It was only a matter of time before the friction between their opposing worlds would ignite, setting the stage for a tragedy neither of them could have foreseen. The golden hues of autumn had long since faded, giving way to the chill of early winter in Briarwood Heights. The town, so vibrant during the Harvest Festival, now seemed quieter, almost introspective. It was in this subdued atmosphere that Ilara Sinclair found herself caught in the spell of Marcus Greystone, a man who had seamlessly entered her life and made her feel as though she were the center of his universe. The evening of their first dinner was crisp, the air carrying the scent of pine and earth as Marcus arrived at the restaurant, a quiet, upscale bistro on the outskirts of town. The atmosphere inside was intimate, with dim lighting casting soft shadows on the walls, and a fire crackling gently in the hearth. Marcus was impeccably dressed, as always, his presence commanding yet somehow comforting. Ilara, dressed in a simple dark green dress, couldn't help but feel both out of place and utterly captivated by his attention. As they sat down at their table, Marcus's gaze never wavered from her face. His eyes held an intensity that unnerved her, but in a way, it was also flattering. He asked about her childhood, her art, her dreams, and listened intently to every word, as though each syllable she spoke was a puzzle piece to a grand picture he was determined to understand. His charm was undeniable, it was like a velvet rope that drew her in closer, inch by inch. "Your art, it's remarkable, Ilara," Marcus said, leaning forward slightly. "There's so much emotion in your work, but I wonder, have you considered exploring a more commercial angle? Something with a broader reach? Your potential is limitless, and I want to help you achieve that." Ilara, still unsure about this new dynamic, found herself nodding. She had always dreamed of making a name for herself, but the idea of transforming her art into something marketable had never quite sat right with her. Yet Marcus's words felt like a reassurance, like a promise that she could have both, the success she desired and the integrity she held so dearly. They spent the evening talking about everything: art, life, their shared love of nature. Marcus shared stories of his childhood, painting a picture of a life filled with privilege and discipline, a life where nothing was left to chance. Elara listened intently, intrigued by his sharp intellect and his ability to speak with such authority on subjects she hadn't even thought about before. In his presence, she felt small yet significant, as if he were a force of nature, and she was somehow drawn to him, swept up in the current. By the time the evening came to a close, Marcus had already made plans for their next meeting. "You're incredibly talented, Elara," he said, his voice low and steady. "I want to help you take your work to the next level. I know the right people, the kind of people who can make your dreams a reality. Let me help." She hesitated for a moment, but his piercing gaze softened as he reached for her hand. "I see something in you, Elara. Something unique. You don't have to do this alone." In that moment, Elara felt a flicker of doubt, but it was quickly quelled by the warmth of his touch and the sincerity in his words. I'd like that," she replied quietly. Over the following weeks, Marcus's presence in Elara's life grew stronger, more constant. He was always there, at her studio, at the local cafe where she had her morning coffee, even bringing her lunch during her hectic workdays. Each time he appeared, he seemed to know exactly what she needed before she even had a chance to ask. Whether it was a freshly brewed coffee with just the right amount of cream or a bouquet of flowers that reflected the colors of the season, Marcus's gestures were never anything short of thoughtful. At first, Elara was flattered. She had never experienced such attention, such consideration. He showered her with praise, telling her how talented she was, how special she was, how her art had the potential to change the world. To her, it was the kind of attention she had always longed for, the kind that felt like validation for her years of hard work and self-doubt. But soon, Marcus's actions began to take on a more subtle, insidious form. It started with small suggestions about her art. "Have you thought about adjusting your color palette a little?" he asked one day, his voice calm but certain. "I think a more muted tone would resonate better with a wider audience." At first, Elara saw this as constructive criticism, an artist helping another to improve. She made the changes he suggested, even though it went against the vibrant, expressive style she had cultivated for years. When she showed the new work to Marcus, he was pleased. "This is what I've been talking about," he said, giving her a look of approval. "It's beautiful, Elara. Perfect." The compliments kept coming, each one designed to make her feel validated and seen. But there was an undercurrent to his praise, a sense of ownership in his words. He was shaping her, guiding her down a path that was not her own. As their relationship progressed, the control became more pronounced. Marcus started making suggestions not just about her art but about every aspect of her life. He chose the restaurants they dined at, always selecting the best, most refined places in town. He directed their conversations, steering them away from topics he deemed unnecessary and focusing instead on things he found interesting. One evening, after a particularly lovely dinner, Marcus suggested that Elara should reconsider the way she dressed. "You have such natural beauty," he said, "but you could make a stronger impression with a more polished look. A little more sophistication, don't you think?" Elara, caught off guard but swayed by his opinion, agreed. "I'll give it a try," she said, not fully understanding the shift that was happening in their relationship. The days turned into weeks, and with each passing moment, Marcus's influence over her deepened. Elara, once a free-spirited artist, began to transform. The woman who once wore simple, flowing dresses now found herself dressing in sleek, tailored outfits that Marcus had carefully chosen for her. The colors in her art grew more muted, more restrained. She no longer spent hours in the woods sketching wildflowers for the joy of it. Instead, she took on more commissioned work, projects that were guaranteed to bring in money, but lacked the passion that had once driven her. And through it all, Marcus stood at her side, ever present, ever guiding, ever pushing her towards a future he had designed for her. As their relationship deepened, Elara found herself losing more and more of the person she used to be. Yet, with every step she took further into Marcus's world, she was convinced that she was becoming something better, something worthy of the love and admiration he had promised her. But as she would soon learn, love was never what Marcus had in mind. As the weeks turned into months, Elara's world began to shrink. The vibrant life she once knew, filled with spontaneous walks through the woods, long conversations with friends, and endless hours spent pouring her heart into her art, was slowly being replaced by a rigid routine dictated by Marcus Greystone. At first, she welcomed the change, convincing herself that it was a natural progression in their relationship. After all, Marcus had always been supportive, always there, offering guidance and structure. But beneath the surface, his guidance began to feel more like a prison. It started with small changes, almost imperceptible at first. Marcus would casually suggest changes to her studio setup, urging her to keep things more organized. "A tidy space fosters creativity, Elara," he would say, his voice calm and soothing. So, she reorganized her materials, her brushes, her canvases, all in line with his meticulous standards. He praised her efforts, but there was always a lingering feeling that he wasn't just helping her, he was controlling her. Next came the schedule. Marcus, ever the planner, devised a daily routine for her. "You need structure, Elara. It will help you focus on your work," he insisted. She was hesitant at first but then relented, feeling the pressure to please him. He set times for when she should wake up, when she should eat, and when she should work. At first, it seemed harmless, a way to be more productive. But soon, she found herself restricted by the clock, unable to even step outside for a breath of fresh air without feeling guilty for not adhering to the schedule. Her mornings were spent drawing, work dictated by Marcus's suggestions. She no longer painted for the joy of it, but to meet the demands he set. Her evenings were consumed with social obligations, mostly with Marcus's business associates. "You need to network, Elara. It's important for your future," Marcus would say. But Elara found herself growing more and more detached from her own needs and desires. The conversations at these events revolved around commerce and status, leaving her feeling empty and disillusioned. She missed the genuine connections she used to have with her friends and family, but Marcus always had a ready excuse. "They don't understand your potential like I do," he would tell her. "They're holding you back." One evening, Marcus made a suggestion that would change everything. "You should move in with me," he said, his tone casual but firm. "We'll save money, and it'll be easier for you to focus on your work. We can build our future together, Elara." At first, Elara hesitated. She enjoyed the space and independence her current home gave her. But Marcus's persuasive charm wore down her resistance. He promised her that living together would bring them closer, that it was a step towards a future they both wanted. And, secretly, Elara craved the stability he seemed to offer. So, she agreed. The moment she moved into Marcus's home, the shift in power became even more apparent. His house, a sprawling, modern mansion on the outskirts of Briarwood Heights, was both beautiful and isolating. The windows looked out onto an expanse of woods that seemed to stretch for miles, and the house itself was meticulously organized. Everything had its place, and nothing was ever out of line. At first, the new home felt like a dream, a place where they could build their life together. But as the days went by, Elara began to notice subtle changes in her routine. Marcus began to take control of every aspect of their shared space. He dictated the times for meals, choosing the menu with precision. "We'll have breakfast at 7 a.m. sharp," he said one morning, his voice firm but not unkind. "I've already planned the week's meals." The menu was healthy, meticulously designed to give her the energy she needed, but it left no room for spontaneity or indulgence. No more late-night snacks or spontaneous cups of coffee on a lazy morning. As the weeks went on, the control over Ilara's life grew more intense. Marcus started dictating what she wore. "You'd look amazing in this," he said, presenting her with an elegant, conservative outfit one afternoon. It was a stark contrast to the free-spirited dresses she once favored, but Marcus assured her it would make a better impression. "You'll be taken more seriously if you dress this way. It's important for your career." Ilara tried to push back at first. "I'm comfortable in what I wear, Marcus," she said one evening, frustrated by his constant interference. "I like my clothes." But Marcus's expression hardened. "I'm only trying to help you," he said. "I want to see you succeed. If you want to be taken seriously, you need to present yourself a certain way." And so, little by little, Ilara began to change. She started wearing the clothes Marcus suggested, muting her style to fit his vision of what she should be. The woman who once thrived on self-expression through her art and attire was now quietly conforming to Marcus's ideal. Ilara's social circle also began to dwindle. Marcus made sure she spent less and less time with her friends and family. He would often make subtle remarks about how they didn't understand her or how they were holding her back. At first, Ilara argued with him, but his words stuck with her, eroding her sense of autonomy. Her parents, once her biggest supporters, became increasingly concerned. "We haven't seen you in weeks," Ilara, her mother, Evelyn, said one evening when she finally came to visit. "You've been so busy with your work, haven't you? And with Marcus. It's good to be focused, but don't forget about us. Don't forget who you are." But when Ilara tried to speak up, Marcus was quick to interject. "It's not that, Evelyn. Ilara is just committed to her future. We're building something great together." Ilara, caught between her family and Marcus, felt trapped. She didn't want to disappoint her parents, but she also didn't want to upset Marcus. Slowly, her sense of self began to erode, piece by piece, like a painting slowly losing its colors. She spent her days working on art that no longer felt like her own, and her nights were filled with Marcus's expectations that seemed to grow heavier with each passing day. The phone calls with friends grew infrequent. Her once vibrant social media profiles, once full of spontaneous adventures and artistic expression, were now silent. And as she looked in the mirror, she barely recognized the woman staring back at her. The spark she once had was dimming, and she felt herself slipping away, lost in a life that wasn't hers to begin with. In this new world, Marcus had become the center of her universe, her mentor, her lover, and her controller. But the price of her compliance was high, and Ilara was beginning to feel the weight of it on her shoulders. As the days passed, she couldn't help but wonder, is this really the life I want? But with every question that arose, there was another voice, Marcus's voice, telling her to be patient, to trust him. And she did. For now. The weight of Ilara's new life, dominated by Marcus's increasingly suffocating control, grew heavier with each passing day. In the mansion on the outskirts of Briarwood Heights, she found herself living in a gilded cage, beautiful, but confining. The subtle threads of control Marcus had woven around her now seemed like iron chains, impossible to break. Yet, there was a part of her that still clung to the idea of freedom, buried deep within her heart. But it was only a matter of time before someone would notice. Someone who still cared enough to fight for her. It was Caleb, her brother, her protector, and the one person who had always been able to see past the facade Marcus presented. Caleb had never trusted Marcus, despite his charm and the allure of his promises. From the moment Ilara had met him, Caleb had felt something was off, though he couldn't put his finger on it. But as the weeks went by and Ilara distanced herself more and more from her family, his worry turned into suspicion. The first sign came when he tried to call her one evening, only for Marcus to answer the phone. "Ilara's busy right now," Marcus had said smoothly. "She's working on some important projects. I'll tell her you called." The conversation had been short, the tone just a little too polite, a little too rehearsed. Caleb's instincts told him something was wrong. He could hear it in Marcus's voice, an undercurrent of control, a subtle possessiveness that sent chills down his spine. Caleb tried again the following week. This time, he managed to speak with Alara briefly, but she was distant. She spoke in short sentences, almost as if she were afraid to say too much. "I'm fine, Caleb," she reassured him, though there was a shakiness in her voice that he couldn't ignore. "I've just been busy with work. Marcus is really helping me. He's been great." But it wasn't like Alara to sound so uncertain. She had always been confident, passionate about her art, and fiercely independent. What had happened to the woman he once knew? The woman who would stay up all night sketching wildflowers in the forest? The woman who had once been so sure of herself? Caleb's concern grew into something deeper. He decided to pay a visit to her, to see for himself if she was truly okay. But each time he suggested it, Alara seemed to find an excuse, her reluctance palpable. Finally, he knew he couldn't wait any longer. He had to act. Caleb knew that confronting Marcus directly wouldn't get him anywhere. The man was too polished, too charming. But Caleb had always been resourceful, and he wasn't about to let Marcus get away with whatever was happening to his sister. He started asking questions around town. At first, the responses were casual. Marcus was well liked in Briarwood Heights, a successful businessman with a reputation for generosity. But as Caleb pressed further, he began to hear whispers, offhand comments from old acquaintances, people who had worked with Marcus in the past. "He's a bit intense," one man said hesitantly, while another commented, "Marcus can be a bit controlling at times. You know, always has to have everything just so." These comments were subtle, but they painted a picture. Caleb felt a growing sense of unease as he dug deeper. He found that Marcus's past was clouded with rumors of past relationships, all of which seemed to end under mysterious, often uncomfortable circumstances. No one could quite confirm anything, but the pattern was clear. Caleb's breakthrough came when he tracked down one of Marcus's former girlfriends. She had moved out of state after their relationship ended, but she was willing to speak with Caleb. Hesitantly, she shared her story, her voice trembling as she spoke of how Marcus had manipulated her, slowly isolated her from friends and family, and dictated every aspect of her life. The woman's story was eerily familiar to what Caleb had suspected. It wasn't just love Marcus craved, it was control. He didn't just want Alara's heart, he wanted to own her, to shape her into something that fit his ideal. Caleb's heart sank as he realized the depth of what his sister was enduring. He wasn't sure how he would get through to Alara, but he knew one thing: he couldn't wait any longer. Armed with this new information, Caleb made a decision. He had to confront Marcus. He had to make Alara see the truth, even if it meant shattering the illusion Marcus had so carefully built around her. One evening, Caleb drove to Marcus's mansion, his heart pounding with a mix of fear and determination. As he parked outside, he felt the familiar rush of protective instinct. This was his sister. He wasn't going to let her slip further into Marcus's grip. Marcus answered the door with that same practiced smile, but Caleb could see the flicker of irritation in his eyes. "Caleb, to what do I owe the pleasure?" Marcus's tone was smooth, but there was an edge to it, as though he knew something was about to change. "I need to talk to Alara," Caleb said firmly. "Now." Marcus's smile faltered, but he stepped aside, motioning for Caleb to enter. "She's busy at the moment," Marcus said, but Caleb wasn't having it. He pushed past him, moving through the house, searching for Alara. Finally, he found her in the studio, just as he had suspected. She was hunched over a canvas, her face pale, her eyes distant. She barely looked up when Caleb entered. "Alara," he said softly, his voice breaking through the silence. "We need to talk." She looked at him, confusion flickering in her eyes. "Caleb, I'm fine," she said, but there was no conviction in her voice. Marcus has been helping me. He's been so supportive. Caleb's heart broke at the sight of his sister, so changed. Elara, this isn't you, he said, his voice shaking. You don't need him to do this. You don't need him to control you. At those words, something shifted in Elara's eyes. It was as if a veil had been lifted, and she could finally see the truth. Her hands trembled as she set down the paintbrush, her gaze drifting to the window, as though searching for something to hold on to. Caleb. I don't know what's happened to me, she whispered. I've changed. I don't know how to go back. Caleb stepped forward, his voice full of quiet urgency. You don't have to go back. You can be yourself again. You just need to see what he's doing. This isn't love, Elara. It's control. It's manipulation. As Elara looked at her brother, something inside her cracked. She felt a flicker of the woman she used to be, the one who painted with passion and lived without fear. She felt a tear slip down her cheek as the weight of it all finally began to sink in. Caleb had broken through. And in that moment, Elara began to wake up. This was the first step in Elara's journey back to herself. The road ahead would be difficult, but for the first time in months, she saw a glimmer of hope. The evening had settled into an eerie stillness, the kind of silence that only comes when something momentous is about to unfold. Elara sat in the studio, her hands shaking slightly as she stared at the unfinished canvas before her. Her mind raced, still processing the conversation she had with Caleb earlier that evening. It had been the wake-up call she needed, her brother's words had cut through the fog of confusion Marcus had so carefully built around her. But even now, as the weight of the truth settled in, a gnawing feeling of dread gripped her heart. She knew that confronting Marcus was inevitable, but she didn't know if she was truly ready for what was coming next. Marcus had been distant since Caleb's visit, but Elara could feel his presence looming over her, like a shadow that never quite left. The house, though vast and beautifully designed, felt suffocating to her now. Every step she took, every breath she drew seemed heavy with the knowledge that Marcus was still watching, still controlling. For the first time, Elara realized just how much he had eroded her sense of self, how much of her autonomy had been stripped away in the name of love. It wasn't until the evening's quiet was broken by the sound of footsteps in the hallway that Elara's unease truly solidified into something more visceral. Marcus had been pacing the house, his frustration palpable, though he tried to hide it behind his composed exterior. Elara could hear him muttering under his breath, the words just out of reach, but the tension was thick enough to feel. Suddenly, Marcus appeared in the doorway of the studio. His expression was unreadable, but there was an edge to his gaze, a coldness that sent a shiver down Elara's spine. He stood there, silently watching her, his eyes narrowing with a kind of quiet fury. "We need to talk, Elara," he said, his voice calm but charged with an underlying menace. Elara's heart raced, her hands clenched into fists. She stood, taking a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment pressing in on her. She had known this confrontation was coming, but she hadn't anticipated the full force of it. Still, the time had come. "I think it's time we do," she said, her voice trembling but determined. Marcus stepped into the room, closing the door softly behind him. His eyes never left hers as he approached, his steps measured and deliberate. "I don't understand why you're doing this," he began, his voice smooth, almost pleading. "I've done everything for you, Elara. Everything I've done is to help you. I gave you everything you wanted, success, stability, a future. And this is how you repay me?" Elara swallowed hard, trying to steady her breath. She could feel the words rising in her throat, but it was difficult to speak, difficult to find the courage to fully confront the man who had so thoroughly manipulated her. "You didn't give me anything, Marcus," she said, her voice growing steadier with each word. "You took everything from me. My art, my freedom, my sense of self. You've controlled me from the moment we met, and I'm done. I'm done with you." The words hung in the air, and for a moment, Marcus said nothing. His expression didn't change, but there was a flicker of something, anger, perhaps, behind his eyes. Then, in a swift motion, his demeanor shifted. His calm mask fell away, and the man standing before her was no longer the charming, supportive figure she had once admired. Instead, he was something darker, something dangerous. "You ungrateful little," Marcus's voice broke through, low and cold. He stepped toward her, his movements quick and violent. "You think you can just walk away from this? You think you can walk away from me after everything I've done for you? You'll never get away from me, Elara. You're mine." Elara stumbled back, her heart pounding in her chest. The anger in his voice, the fury that had suddenly overtaken him, was terrifying. She could see now what Caleb had feared, what she had refused to acknowledge for so long, the depth of Marcus's obsession with control, the way he believed he had the right to dominate her, to shape her into something she was never meant to be. "Get away from me!" Elara shouted, stepping back, her voice shaking with a mixture of fear and defiance. "I'm not yours. I'm not your project. I'm not your possession." Marcus's expression twisted, and without warning, he lunged toward her, grabbing her wrist with a grip so tight it made her gasp in pain. "You don't get to decide that," he hissed, his breath hot and heavy. "I've already decided for you." Elara fought to pull away, but his hold was like iron. Her pulse raced, her mind racing through the panic that gripped her. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think, she only knew that she had to get away, had to break free. She gathered all the strength she could muster and yanked her arm back, the force of it surprising both of them. Marcus stumbled, his grip loosening just enough for her to break free. But as she moved toward the door, Marcus regained his balance and turned toward her, his eyes now filled with something even more chilling, the realization that he had lost control. "Don't you dare leave me," he warned, his voice dangerously low. His eyes darkened as he advanced toward her again. "You think you can just walk out? No one walks away from me." In the heat of the moment, Elara realized she had no choice. She couldn't escape him through words anymore. He was beyond reason. Desperation surged through her as she turned and bolted toward the door, only for Marcus to grab her by the shoulder, spinning her around forcefully. In the chaos that followed, Elara tried to break free, but it happened so quickly, too quickly. As she struggled against him, Marcus's anger exploded. In a split second, he shoved her backward with such force that Elara lost her footing, crashing into the marble fireplace. The sickening sound of her head striking the sharp edge sent a shockwave of horror through the room. She collapsed to the floor, blood pooling around her. Marcus froze for a moment, his face a mask of disbelief. Then, as reality sank in, he muttered incoherently, his hands trembling. It was an accident, it was self-defense. But Elara couldn't hear him anymore. The world around her spun as her consciousness faded, the last thing she saw being Marcus, crouching by her side, his hands on his head as sirens wailed in the distance. The moment of violence had shattered everything, Marcus's carefully constructed facade, Elara's hope for escape, and the very foundation of their twisted relationship. The truth was undeniable now. Marcus had crossed a line from which there would be no return. The tragic events set in motion a chain reaction that would change everything for Elara, and for Marcus. He whirled around. Elara seemed distant and muffled, as though she were floating in a thick fog. The sharp pain at the back of her head, the blood staining her clothes, and the cold hardness of the floor beneath her all felt surreal, like a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. As her body lay motionless on the floor, the sounds of sirens grew louder, cutting through the oppressive silence of the room. Somewhere, distantly, Marcus's voice was muttering, pleading, but it all faded into an echo that seemed worlds away from the terrifying reality she had just experienced. The house, once a symbol of stability, had become a prison. And in that moment, Elara realized the true cost of Marcus's control. It wasn't just the loss of her independence or the slow erasure of her identity, it was the violence that always lay beneath the surface. She had been suffocating in that gilded cage, not just emotionally, but physically as well. When the paramedics arrived, Ilara was still conscious, though barely. She heard their voices, muffled through the haze, as they quickly worked to stabilize her. The pressure on her head was intense, but she welcomed it, knowing it was the only thing holding her together. The police arrived shortly after, their voices sharp and authoritative as they swept through the house. The scene was chaotic. Marcus, still in a state of shock, sat in a corner, his face buried in his hands, muttering to himself. He had fallen apart in the aftermath, unable to comprehend the full scale of what he had done. His carefully cultivated image of control had shattered, and with it, his grip on Ilara's life. Detective Charlotte Hawthorne, a seasoned investigator with the Pine Grove Police Department, stepped into the room. Her keen eyes scanned the scene with meticulous precision. She took in the overturned furniture, the bloodstains on the floor, and the two people at the center of the chaos, Ilara, barely clinging to life, and Marcus, broken and unrecognizable from the man he had once seemed to be. The investigation unfolded quickly. Marcus's confession was hardly needed, his actions spoke for themselves. But Detective Hawthorne's team worked relentlessly to uncover every detail. They interviewed friends, family, and colleagues, piecing together the history of Marcus's manipulation and control. It was clear from the testimonies that Ilara had been isolated for months, her once vibrant life dimmed by Marcus's subtle and not-so-subtle efforts to dominate her every choice. For Ilara's family, the pain of her suffering was unbearable. Evelyn and Arthur Sinclair arrived at the hospital, their faces drawn with worry and fear. They had known something was wrong for months, but they had never imagined it would come to this: violence, betrayal, and the near loss of their daughter. Caleb's absence was the sharpest wound of all. He had tried to warn her, tried to reach her, but in the end, it was too late. The tragedy had stolen the opportunity for a reunion, for a moment of clarity before things escalated. Despite the overwhelming evidence against Marcus, the road to justice was far from simple. The legal proceedings were long and grueling, as Marcus's defense team tried to paint a picture of an accident, of a man pushed to the edge by a woman who had been ungrateful for his help. But the evidence was irrefutable. Marcus had been manipulative, controlling, and ultimately violent. His attempts to justify his actions fell apart in the courtroom. In the end, Marcus was convicted of manslaughter and sentenced to 25 years to life. The judge's words were sharp and unforgiving, delivering justice for Caleb and Ilara, even as the weight of the sentence failed to undo the damage done. Ilara spent weeks in the hospital recovering from her injuries. Her body healed, but her soul was a different story. She had been torn apart, not just physically, but emotionally, mentally, and spiritually. The scars of Marcus's control were deep, woven into the very fabric of her being. Yet, as time passed, she began to feel the stirrings of something she hadn't felt in months: hope. A glimmer of the woman she had once been began to resurface. It was a slow, painful process, but it was progress. In therapy, Ilara began to unpack the years of manipulation and isolation she had endured. The pain of losing herself, of losing her art, her relationships, and her sense of self, was overwhelming. But with each session, she started to reclaim pieces of herself. She was no longer the woman who lived in fear of Marcus's approval. She was someone new, someone who could heal, rebuild, and find her own path again. Months later, Ilara opened her first gallery showing since the incident. The exhibit was a celebration of the freedom she had fought so hard to regain. The works were raw and personal, each piece reflecting a different part of her journey: the darkness she had emerged from, the strength she had found within, and the beauty of reclaiming her life. As the guests wandered through the gallery, Ilara stood quietly in the corner, watching them. It wasn't the applause she sought, but the quiet acknowledgement of her resilience. She had survived. She had broken free. And now, she was free to create once more. Ilara's story is one of survival, of breaking free from a toxic relationship and reclaiming one's life. But it's also a reminder of the signs of emotional and psychological abuse that can go unnoticed. What do you think about Alara's journey? How do you think she managed to regain her sense of self after everything she went through? Have you ever witnessed or experienced anything similar in your life or the lives of people around you? We'd love to hear your thoughts on this story. Please leave a comment below and share your perspective. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more true crime stories and discussions. Your engagement is important to us. Let's continue the conversation and raise awareness about these important issues. What's your opinion on Marcus's actions? Was justice truly served? Let's talk.